Brian is a star of sorts at the university. He did his graduate work mainly at Michigan State University and has been here for, oh gosh, I'm not sure how many years, Brian, but it must be a few by now. Has become, in recent years, the chair of the Department of Political Science. Widely known and well respected by everyone, I think, at the university and certainly within the department. And I'm sure he has a lot to say to us about the, the election landscape in the United States today. That is an area that he's paid particular attention to, and I look forward to hearing him. Welcome, Brian, wherever you are.
Yeah, wonderful. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you. Thank you all for having me. It's always such a fun group. I enjoy talking with you so much. And let me preface my remarks by saying that you know, as a political scientist, I think I've got a good idea about elections, the factors that are important in shaping elections, but they're always conditional. I don't know what those factors will be on election day. I don't know what those factors will look like on election day, right? So things change really rapidly in politics. That's always the case, okay? But what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about the presidential election. I've got a slideshow, but maybe what I'll do is just share a few of those slides with you. I've got a bunch of numbers worked up on the House and the Senate. So, you know, I've got a lot of numbers there in my slideshow, but maybe what I'll do is just talk for a few minutes about the landscape of the election. And then, you know, we'll take questions, and I'm sure you all have lots of interesting questions. So I hope that sounds okay to folks.
Jim Robinson, can you mute? Please?
Okay. So let me start with just a little background. I'm going to pull up my little bit of a slideshow for you. If I can share my screen here. And let me jump down a couple of slides and talk first just for a few minutes about the presidential election. And, you know, one of the first things I want to say is that I don't think we should be surprised at how competitive this election is. It's a very competitive election. If you look at the history of presidential elections since 1932, the last 14 presidential elections from 1932 to 88, the vast majority of those presidential elections saw the winning presidential candidate receive 80% or more of the electoral vote. But since 1988, none has received more than 70% of the electoral vote. So, you know, the last 30 years especially have been particularly competitive in terms of presidential races. In terms of control of Congress, you have a very similar story, especially since 1980. You've seen the Senate majority change hands 7 times, with each party controlling the Senate for about 10 Congresses. And in the House, you've seen the House of Representatives change party control in that same period 4 times. And again, with each party controlling the House of Representative majority for about 10 Congresses. So when you look at our landscape, our electoral landscape, the last 30 or 40 years, very, very competitive races. So we're in this era of very competitive parties, very competitive elections. And as you might guess, and I mean, some of us might be troubled by this a little bit. Oftentimes it seems party leaders, their decisions are often geared towards, of course, the electoral map in elections, right? So so that's another kind of, I think, important kind of aspect to our politics. But it's certainly very, very competitive out there right now. And so if we look at the current state of the race between Biden and Trump, it's been a relatively stable race for a period of time now. So when we look at the polls that I pay attention to, there are a couple of really interesting sites. Real Clear Politics keeps track of the polls, of all of the national polls. You see Biden with about a 6.5 point lead in the national polls. That's tightened up over the last couple of weeks, and to be honest, I really don't know how the RBG vacancy is going to affect the elections. I see a lot of arguments on both sides of that, and I'm sure something that you'll want me to talk more about, or that we might have some questions about that we can talk about in the near term here as we go. But when we think about some of the fundamentals, especially of during presidential election years, of course, state of the economy is very, very important. So, you know, how's the national GDP? What's the unemployment rate? Those are real pocketbook indicators, I think, about the state of the economy that have historically had a significant impact on presidential elections. Okay, certainly presidential approval has been an important factor for President Trump. Presidential approval has been relatively very consistent across his term. It has not varied very much. And oftentimes we see voters have what we might call a change factor that motivates them. So sometimes if you have one party in control of the White House for a term or two, you'll have voters that will react to that. They'll be looking for a change, especially newer voters or voters that don't vote very often. Oftentimes that will have an impact on them. In terms of the issues, I haven't had a chance to update my issues slide here, but you'll see, I think, on voters' mind, certainly ending the pandemic, I think, is something that you don't have to remind voters about. Economic recovery, certainly with unemployment rates hovering around 8.5%, that's got to be an issue that weighs heavily on voters' minds, I think. Healthcare, the future of healthcare. Earlier in the summer, there was a big emphasis with the death of George Floyd and protests, racial justice reform, and then, of course, climate change and energy. And like I said, I would add to this list, of course, the passing of Justice Ginsburg on here as well, be a very important factor in the presidential elections. Okay, so let me share something else with you. So this is one of the many electoral maps you can view out there, but this electoral map is from Real Clear Politics. As I suggested to you, that this is a site that I kind of read articles from and watch the polls from quite actively during election time. They do a pretty good job of posting their polls and the data that they have. But you can see, you know, we're in a pretty tight race. We've got a lot of toss-up states in the Electoral College. So typical Midwestern states that you see out there: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, that Trump won the first time in 2016. Those are very, very competitive. The polls remain competitive in those states. You have some other states that are somewhat newcomers to the competitive scene. So states like Arizona is an interesting Sun Belt state that has, because of change in demographics over the years, become, I think, a state where Democrats can certainly compete. And right now, that is one of the pickup states that I think Democrats are hoping to take in the Biden campaign. Some other typical states that you see all the time that have remained competitive: states like Florida, obviously a major state. Ohio, always a bellwether. North Carolina, right? These are states that tend to be in play all the time, at least in the contemporary elections. You also have Texas and Georgia on that map. You'll see there as well as possible toss-up states. So any of those states, a Texas or a Georgia, Arizona, those would really change the kind of traditional pathway for both candidates, right? So if Biden could pick up Arizona, that would mean that Trump would have to really run the gamut on a lot of those toss-up states that you see there. Okay, if Biden were able to pick up maybe Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, you know, those Midwestern states that Trump had won in 2016, that would also make the path narrower for President Trump. So a lot of states in play in terms of the Electoral College. So I just wanted to point that out to you, along with our earlier discussion about just how competitive our elections are. Okay, so why don't I come back to you? Where do I come back to you at? Let's see. So let me come back to you. And so now I've kind of given you a little bit of an overview of, I think, a fairly steady but very competitive presidential race. Let me see what kinds of questions are out there. We can talk about the Senate, we can talk about the House, we can talk more about this particular race. But what kinds of questions can I answer for you? What kinds of things are on your mind?
Brian, this is Lee Fisher. You mentioned in those factors, obviously, ending the pandemic and unemployment. Do you think in light of the COVID issue that those are going to wash based on people understanding that the disease caused unemployment? Are those going to be less of a factor in the presidential race or more of a factor, do you think?
Well, it probably depends on people's view on who's responsible, you know, or if there's any responsibility at all on you know, the administration for the COVID environment that we're in. So I think some people might view it that you know, the president has more responsibility there, and other people would probably view it differently. So it really comes down to how they view it, and then how it ties to the economy. But I agree with you. It's certainly the case that COVID is intricately tied with our economy. So we're not going to solve the economic challenges until we solve the COVID challenges, right? They're going to go hand in hand.
Brian, got a question for you. Back in 2016, after the election, everybody that had made incorrect predictions was talking about how polling wasn't as reliable as it used to be. What sort of structural changes have been made, if any, to make the polls you're looking at now any more accurate?
So that's a good question. I get that question a lot about the polls. And what I would say is a couple of things about the polls in 2016. The national polls in 2016 were as really as accurate as the historical patterns that we have. So the national polls in 2016, many of those predicted about 2.8% or about 3% in terms of the popular vote for Hillary Clinton, which is what she beat Trump by in terms of the popular vote. But as you know, the popular vote there's not an exact correlation between the popular vote and the electoral vote. But the polls in the states in 2016 were incredibly poor. So the national polls were good. The state polls were bad in 2016. Okay. And so a lot of the structural issues there in the state polls, a lot of it had to do with a lot of times organizations at the state level are running polls. They're oftentimes not very well funded. They might just do polling every 4 years, so they don't have a whole heck of a lot of expertise like national pollsters might. So have those things been fixed? I think people have looked at those things, and I think people understand, especially in 2016, those state polls had a lot of difficulty with overweighting college educated voters and underweighting non-college educated voters. That was one of the things that came out in the studies that were done on the state poll. So at least some of the things that went wrong at the state poll level, folks know about. But your question, how have those things been fixed systematically? I don't know. So the state polls could be wrong again. You know, that's possible. The other thing I'll say about 2016 that was difficult was in states like Florida, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, there were a disproportionate number of undecided voters, around 15% of undecided voters very late in the election cycle, and they broke disproportionately towards President Trump. So they really swung towards President Trump. And so, you know, as you know, if you add up the votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan and Wisconsin, I mean, those were won by about 100, those three states, Trump won by about 100,000 votes. So there was that big swing that made a big difference. One of the differences I would say in this election, going into this election, I don't think you have as many undecided voters as you did in 2016. You're still going to have some, but I don't think as many. So I wouldn't expect the swing to be as big, but there still might be a swing, and it still might be enough, to knock out some of those states and put some of those states in President Trump's column. But your question's a good one, Pat, about the state polling, but I would just differentiate the state polling from the national polling.
Brian, it's Warren. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, by the way.
Hey, Warren.
The Senate looks to be particularly interesting this time around. And I wonder if you just take a few moments to focus your attention on the Senate and tell us where you think which way do you think the tide is moving, or which are the more interesting races?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Warren. And like I said, I haven't had time to update my slide about Justice Ginsburg and what that does. But I think if you look at overall, I think the Democrats have just the slightest edge to take a majority in the Senate. Now, if you look at the numbers, the Democrats would have to win 4 Senate seats to take a majority in this race, okay? Or if Biden won the White House, they'd need 3, okay? So depending on what happens in the White House decide the factor there in terms of the Senate. But if you look at the Senate, certainly it's the case Doug Jones from Alabama is the most at risk. The Democrat from Alabama, he's going to lose, I think. I don't think there's any doubt about that. So if you write off Doug Jones, you've got other important Senate seats in play. You have Arizona right now, which I think there's Mark Kelly, I think, is in a strong position in Arizona to take that Senate seat for the Democrats. I think a couple of other seats that are the most in play, I think Colorado, the Colorado Senate seat, I think the Democrats have a very good shot at. So that's two. And if you think about some others are really very, very close. So the Iowa Senate seat with Joni Ernst. So, will she be able to pull that out?
Montana.
So I think there are really about 4 or 5 different Senate seats that are really in play. Now, what's interesting about 2016 is that those Senate seats always went to the presidential candidate that won the state. And so, will we see that again, or will we see a little bit more split ticket voting? I don't anticipate seeing as much split ticket voting, especially now with Justice Ginsburg. So, I think you put the Justice Ginsburg issue up on the election board. I think that might favor Republicans a little bit in states like Iowa, in states like North Carolina, for example, that might give them the push to win those Senate seats.
I don't see him. I really don't.
Brian,
Yeah.
this is Fred Brower. Assuming that current wisdom is accurate, that President Trump is able to make the appointment to the Supreme Court, what impact do you think that will have on either candidate for president?
Well, it's one of those things that, it's an issue that, because I don't think there's a lot of folks on the sidelines right now with this election, so if would it be the case that there were any kind of conservative evangelicals? Certainly those folks are going to be over the moon with this appointment, right? They're going to be really excited about this appointment, but they were going to go out and vote anyway. Do you know what I'm saying? So I don't know kind of how this issue might energize a particular group that wasn't going to vote before, but that is going to vote now. Do you know what I'm saying? And so it might help a little bit in the margins in terms of, giving candidates a little deeper pockets here in the next 4 or 5 weeks. It might gin up fundraising a little bit more.
It's being recorded.
And those kinds of things. But as I said, I think in terms of the presidential race, I don't think it's going to suddenly turn the presidential race on its head. I think you have a very competitive presidential race, and before the death of Justice Ginsburg, and I think we have a very competitive presidential race after the death of Justice Ginsburg. Do you know what I'm saying? In the Senate, as I said, I think a couple of those states, a couple of those red states where Democrats were competing very well, in those red states, like Iowa, for example, that might, the Justice Ginsburg might give those Senate candidates a little bit more help there for the Republicans. But in terms of the overall race, I expect we're going to have a very tight race. I don't expect that, going from a 5-4 majority to a 6-3 majority is necessarily going to get a lot of people that were on the sidelines before into the election, because I don't think a lot of people were on the sidelines before. Do you know what I'm saying? So you know, it's one of those issues. I just don't know exactly how it's going to play out.
So, Brian, this is Lee Fisher again. So, getting to the vote, the presidential vote based on Ginsburg, do you think gender, based on the candidates that he's proposed, gender will have an impact on that confirmation hearing?
Well, Lee, I think this is one of those things, Lee, that we just don't know how it's going to play out, right? So the confirmation hearings, certainly you're going to hear about Roe v. Wade, I would think. You'll have senators question the candidate, judicial candidate, about where their stance is on that. The short list that I've read about are very conservative judicial candidates. You know, if we think about young women that, you know, if there was a group of young women that were sitting on the sidelines, you know, is that discussion of Roe v. Wade, should it be overturned or not? Is that gonna, you know, is that gonna move them one way or the other? You know, I don't know, you know, it's hard to know how, you know, what issues are gonna resonate in the next, you know, in the next 4 or 5 weeks for that hearing. Do you know what I'm saying? So how are those candidates, how's that judicial candidate going to come across? You know, are they going to take a hard stance on one issue that all of a sudden that's going to become the theme of the whole, you know, the whole hearing, you know? So I think there's certainly some things that could help Republicans with that hearing, you know, and that process, but there's also some unknowns that could go the other way, you know? And so, you know, especially when you look at younger voters and you look at some of those issues, I think younger voters tend to be a little bit more, probably a little bit more liberal on kind of culture war type of issues, you know, like abortion and gay rights and those kinds of things. So, you know, again, it really just depends on what, you know, what group of voters, if any, are sitting on the sidelines right now.
I'm wondering if you could share maybe some history in regards to kind of the current play out of what's going on with the confirmation of a new Supreme Court justice. Obviously, the news has shared kind of the 2016 9-month delay until a new president was elected to bring in a new justice. And now we're seeing the same statements that were used by the Republican majority in 2016 kind of used against them to kind of delay and think about maybe the new, whoever is elected in an election year 40 days away or so from now to kind of push that forward. What are your thoughts on that? Can you comment on that? And then is there a history of that precedent from 2016, something in our history that I'm just not aware of?
Well, no. I mean, there's really not a history of that from 2016.
Yeah, I see Randy. All right.
I'm sorry. So, but you're right. I mean, I think that you know, Mitch McConnell in 2016 saying, well, let's look ahead for the mandate, you know, the new president, let the people decide. And now it's, well, let's look back. We had a mandate in 2018, you know, so we should decide. Right. So, but I don't necessarily think that, you know, at least Republicans, I think, are betting that that's not going to bother voters. Right. I mean, if they thought it was really going to bother voters, they probably wouldn't have done it. I'm thinking. Right. Now, again, whether or not that's something that's going to turn off voters, I don't know. You know, it's, some people would say that's inside baseball. Voters, you know, they really don't care that much about it. You know, it's inside baseball stuff. So it's just hard to say. But you know, I think that it really is interesting if you look at the data on judicial confirmations and appointments over time. I mean, the Republicans under Mitch McConnell they've significantly increased the number of appointments they've made under President Trump by nearly 50% compared to President Obama. So, you know, they're very good. They do very good at kind of pushing those appointments through. Of course, you don't have the filibuster anymore with Harry Reid, former Majority Harry Reid, basically blowing up the filibuster on federal district court judges and appeals court judges, and then McConnell, ending the filibuster with Supreme Court justices. So you don't have the filibuster there anymore, which is really interesting. And so, is that a precedent now for whoever wins the majority Senate that maybe they just get rid of the filibuster for legislation as well, because it ends up they don't do, you really don't do any big legislation unless you do it in the budget process anyway, right? Like healthcare or tax cuts or that kind of thing. Anyway, where you can do it with just a simple majority anyway. So filibuster doesn't necessarily come into play on those issues anyway. But Jonathan, I wish I had a better answer for you. I haven't seen any polling on that question yet because it's so recent. But I would be really curious to see, does that really bother independent voters? Is really the game changer here, right? So it's, is it going to hurt Republicans with independents? I think that's the question, right? So my hypothesis would be most Republican voters that, that's not going to matter, right? But I think it's the independents, that's the big question mark.
Brian, I'd like to say first that I'm glad I'm a historian and not a political scientist and don't have to try to predict this stuff. I wanted to point out that the pollsters were dead wrong in 1936 and 1948 both, so we don't have a brilliant history of polling success. But my question is about scenes like the fires in Kenosha, Wisconsin. I came in a little bit late, so you may have discussed this type of thing. But there are truly some tragic and awful scenes of fires and destruction in Seattle and Portland and Kenosha and so on. And how big an impact is that having on voters, do you think? Well, I'll go leave it at that.
Well, I think that has been a very important issue, and that was one of the issues on my kind of top list that I started with, with the death of George Floyd, I think, and you have kind of a push for social justice, and of course on the other side you had the push for law and order. But I still think that those issues are going to be secondary to the COVID. In terms of being on voters' minds, right? So most political issues, if you had something like the judicial appointment come up, that would be, that would probably take over. That's a huge thing. But in this strange kind of COVID environment that we have, I don't think things like, riots in Seattle or some of the other more typical issues that might gain a lot of traction in a presidential race, I still don't think those issues are going to overpower kind of the COVID, right? So I think voter on people's minds is COVID. I mean, this is the thing that's, this is our kind of Great Depression in terms of probably having a significant impact on people's minds for generations. How did COVID impact us? At least in my lifetime, I think, I can't think of something as big as COVID. So I think that, that's still going to be a really, really important issue.
Brian, this is Lee again. So has there ever been a period in our history that you're aware of where one president or another from either party has been blamed for a disease?
Has been blamed for a disease. I
Well,
mean,
that was the wrong term, but has been the responsibility for controlling a disease been placed on a president from either party?
Well, I mean, I think for voters across the board, Democrats and Republicans, I think when voters think about the presidency, the president's, probably most basic function is to protect citizens, right? And so again, it kind of goes, it kind of goes in terms of how people's views on responsibility, right? So was this just kind of a random, issue that no president could have controlled, or was it an issue that different presidents or different leadership could have controlled in different ways, right? So I think, Lee, it really depends on folks' views on the COVID, and I think that's going to dictate a lot in terms of whether they hold their political leaders responsible or not, for COVID. And kind of we're in this, of course, this federalism. We can look at governors, right? So, some governors have become more popular with how they've handled COVID. Others have become less popular with how they've handled COVID, right? So I don't think there's kind of, one size fits all here. I think you're going to have a lot of different viewpoints from people in different constituencies about how they view that, whether or not they blame the president or they don't blame the president.
Is there?
All right, this is,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, this is Ed Solomon. I just have a question. We keep hearing about the mail-in voting. What do you think the impact's going to be of the mail-in voting on this election?
That's another great question, and it kind of ties in with that question that I got earlier about the polls. That, Pat's question. I think some of the states have done mail-in and absentee voting, and that's basically how they do their elections, and they do it really well. And so now we're in a situation where a lot of states, they're going to significantly expand mail-in voting and their system for mail-in voting, and I don't know how well they're going to be able to do that. So I don't know. I don't know what impact that's gonna have, right? So if we look at a variety of states that have 70 or 80% of their voters would vote in person, and now we're going to have maybe those same states, maybe half will vote in person, or less than half might vote in person, right? I mean, what's going to be the impact of that? We just haven't tried that experiment yet. We just don't have any data on that to say, mail-in voting is gonna, it might help one party, in this state, or it might help the other party in this other state. So it's something that, it's one of those uncertainties that I just don't know how it's gonna play out, Ed. But it's a great question, and I know it's one that a lot of people are focused on, because it could have a really big impact.
Let's have one more question. We'd like our speaker to come back, and to do that, he's got to be able to only take a week to recover from our meeting here. We've been at it pretty hard. So one more question.
Yeah, I'll do it again. Brian, could follow on Ed's question with this mail-in issue. Could that not be an issue that ultimately, once again, gets decided at the Supreme Court level?
Well, it could be. I mean, I was just reading this morning, the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court had ruled that mail-in ballots had to be in a secondary envelope. So in other words, they get a ballot get mailed in an envelope, but they have to be in a second envelope, I guess, for secrecy reasons. And people are projecting that could impact 100,000 ballots in the state of Pennsylvania. Well, I think that's going to go to in front of the Supreme Court. And it'll depend on the Supreme Court making that decision about ballots at that at the state level there. And so, I mean, we could be in a situation where the court gets involved again. I mean, I hope not. I hope we don't have that level of uncertainty the day after the election. But like Ed mentioned, mail-in voting. I mean, how long is it going to take to count those ballots, right? I mean, so like I said, you know, we would expect that states are going to have a significantly larger amount of those mail-in ballots, and so that's going to test those states, I think, in ways that they've not been tested before, and I just don't know how that's going to play out.
Brian, this has been
ballots cards come in
40 minutes.
Second envelope in Ohio. Second envelope
40
is what we
minutes.
use.
And we want to thank you for coming, and what an interesting time we all live in. If there's a follow-up to be done after the election that maybe deserves a discussion, we'd like to have you back. We're going to put a book in the Lane Library in your honor. And as always, you're just a wonderful breath of fresh air in talking to us about this. We all appreciate it very much. Everybody give me a hand. So.
Well, thanks. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I always enjoy this group. Hopefully next time I can be there in person and we'll have lunch together. I always enjoy getting to see and hang out with you all. Thank you.